Okay, we're at session 4 of the Hanford Legacy Lecture Series. Session 4 is Hanford and the Tri-Cities Regional Economic Development. We're going to be going through lectures 11 and 12. And my name is Mike Schwenk, and maybe I should say Ohayo gozaimasu, or konnichiwa, or konbanwa, depending on time of day. It's my pleasure to try and walk you through some of the economic development story and history of the Tri-Cities as it relates to Hanford and what we've been through the last several decades. Now, I've been told never start a presentation with an apology, and I've tried to be true to that over the years until today. But I have two apologies for you. The first has to do with memory. It's pretty fallible, and mine certainly is. And so today I'm going to walk you through a story. I'm going to pepper it with plenty of anecdotes about the history of the Tri-Cities and its economic evolution, if you will. But my memory and that of others in our community don't always agree. And so I'm going to do my best to give you the story through my eyes as best I remember it, but keep in mind that when it comes to certain facts and data and things like that, it may not be completely accurate. And to help with that, there's been a book written about the economic development history of the Tri-Cities called Community Godfather by Mark Smith, who's a good friend of mine and lives here in the Tri-Cities. And if you want to get into the real facts and data, that's a great source to go. Although even when Mark was writing that book, he interviewed me, and he and I and others who he interviewed didn't all agree on exactly how things unfolded. So let's not worry about that, because I have some higher level messages that sort of supersede facts and data. The second apology for you is what I might call wonkiness. This is a story of economics, and it's also a story of psychology. And it's like, anytime you're dealing with money and an economy, that's the realm of economics. Anytime you're dealing with people, you're in the world of psychology. I'm not an economist, and I'm not a psychologist, but I did live through much of what I'm about to share with you, and I can tell you those two things are important, but I'm not a subject matter expert on either one of those. So those are my apologies, and with that, let's sort of get into this. So this will be the first lecture, and part one, which goes back to the early 1960s, and then I'm going to walk you up to around 1990 or so, and then the second phase I'm going to go through from the 90s up to around 2010. And so that's sort of the sequencing of the two parts of this lecture. Just to frame it, we have a picture here that you've probably seen before, you'll see again, showing that where the red stars are kind of going to be this part one. And then from the second red star up to around 2010 is where we're going to be. So that's just a frame of reference in terms of all the lectures that you're hearing and where these two happen to fit in. Okay, so if we go back to the early 60s, we want to start the conversation about the local economic development with an institution and organization that was created in this town called the Tri-City Nuclear Industrial Council. That organization was created by a handful of community leaders, a very small handful of community leaders, actually 3. And it was largely driven by the local newspaper, which was locally owned at the time. And the newspaper publisher at the time was extremely concerned about the economic conditions in the community as it relates to being so Hanford-driven, and the ups and downs that were a result of the federal investment in Hanford and its production mission, which is another way of just saying making plutonium, and how it is that as the money came and went, so did the local economy, which was so heavily dependent on that money. And so the 3 of them got together, created what the acronym is TRICNIC, Tri-City Nuclear Industrial Council, and they had one unpaid staff person That is this person here, Sam Volpentest, and then of course the publisher of the paper and basically his assistant, Bob Phillips, the co-founder, were the ones. It was an incredibly powerful group of individuals politically, and that was because they were very good friends with one of the former governors of the state, Rossellini, and two of the most powerful senators that were in Congress, Henry Scoop Jackson and Warren Magnuson. And it's those friendships that gave them so much clout, both here in the state and back in Washington, D.C. They knew how to leverage those political connections. And how do you do that with any politician? You raise money. And so that was at the root of what kept the relationship strong over the years. So the other piece of this was that they self-funded this organization. And so they weren't dependent on anybody else or really accountable to anybody else because they were putting up the money privately. It had three simple purposes or missions, if you will. One is sustain the material production, the plutonium production activities at Hanford to the maximum extent possible. Search for new federal missions that could complement or supplement those production missions. And then diversify the local contracting. And as I'm about to share with you, one of the biggest, diversify the local economy. And one of the most important things I'm going to talk further about in a second is with respect to the Hanford contracting itself. This was, as I said, basically a largely politically driven agenda. That's how they worked. That's how they thought, and that's how they constructed their asks, if you will. And it's still, even though I'm going to show you some great successes, it still didn't overcome the economic volatility and the ups and downs in the community. Interesting too, again, it was just a handful of individuals who were doing this, so there was not a lot of community engagement. So they didn't spend a lot of time dealing with others. They made the decisions, called the shots, and did their own thing. But there were a number of successes. Interestingly, one of the first occurred right around when they first started. And this to show just how politically powerful they were. The top photo here is of President Kennedy coming out to the Hanford site, 1963 or 4. And what he's doing here is a groundbreaking ceremony for at the end reactor at the Hanford site, where they were adding a private steam generating, electricity generating addition to that reactor. So the reactor was built to make plutonium. That was its primary mission, but in the process, it was a huge reactor. In the process, it had the ability to make a lot of steam. Steam obviously can turn a turbine and turn into electricity. And that's what got built there, and it became a dual generating, dual purpose reactor. And I think it generated some 800 megawatts electric, which is a lot of electricity. So President Kennedy came out, 30,000 people showed up from the community in the surrounding area. The Hanford site had never been open to the public before until this day. And at the heart of all that was Tricknick, making all that happen and leaning on Henry Jackson and Warren Magnuson and their contacts. Another example of the kind of things they did, the photo in the middle here is of the federal, what we call the federal building. They called it Project X. This was a secret project that they worked on with the senators to get funding to build a building in the middle of downtown Richland, and this exists today. And it's got a federal courthouse, and it had the post office at the time as well, and it was a huge addition, as you might imagine, standing, I guess that's about 7 stories tall. Back in the day, that was the skyscraper for the Tri-Cities, and Project X became a big winner. Did it help diversify the economy? Well, I can't say directly that it would, because all it did was house federal employees associated with the cleanup of the Hanford site who were here anyway. But when you do something like this in the middle of a downtown, those employees go out and eat lunch. They use the post office and other services, and things like this have an indirect spin and benefit in the community. So it was a nice addition to the town. The other thing that was going on at this time was it was the heyday, if you will, of the nuclear industry, the early nuclear industry in the United States and around the world, indeed. But building nuclear reactors, all of that was big, and all of the science and technology associated with that was big, big, big business. And given the nuclear expertise of the community, being able to capitalize on that was like a no-brainer. And so there were a number of things that occurred during this time frame. One of which here, the bottom picture, was when a group from the laboratories at the Hanford site actually spun off and created a fuel fabrication business. And this is where familiar names like Exxon, and in those days Exxon Nuclear, which doesn't exist anymore, but in those days did, became huge investors in our community. And where it was, you could leverage the nuclear expertise of the Tri-Cities to create commercial businesses. So this fuel fabrication plant, which still exists today, makes nuclear fuel for commercial nuclear power plants and sells it all over the world. That's diversification, and it was one of the great things that happened during this time. The other thing I wanted to talk about that I think today, my personal opinion, was genius. I kind of, again, these are my words, I kind of call it the ultimate extortion play. But it was brilliant in its way and for its time. But the Hanford contract originally, as you've probably heard through the history of previous sessions, had a single contractor in DuPont during the war, General Electric afterwards. But what came in this era was the notion of breaking that contract up into multiple contractors. And so taking scope at Hanford, the reactors being one thing, the nuclear fuel reprocessing plants being something else, the laboratories being something else, all the support activities being something else, and breaking that up and having multiple contracts instead of just one, and multiple contractors. And the genius part from the community point of view was not just doing that, but to require the bidder, the successful bidder of those contracts, to make an investment in economic diversification in the community. And so this was a first, I think, kind of unheard of. There's been subsequent ones, and we'll talk about that as we go through these. But in the upper left in these images is Sandvik Special Metals. It's a plant that still exists. It's out in Findlay, out in the east part of the Tri-Cities. And it's a titanium tubing manufacturing facility. And you might think of it as the term is cladding, but making the tubing that goes around nuclear fuel for commercial nuclear power plants. And it's had many spin-offs since then, but basically, if you're making it out of titanium and you need it round, these are the guys that know how to make it. And so that was a great addition to the community, a commercial operation selling to private enterprise all over the world. Next to that is the Hanford House. It's a hotel. There was one originally during the war, torn down and replaced by the one which exists today and is still there. But it's like the same thing as I was saying about the federal building. Even though it's hard to say that's a direct contributor to our economy, indirectly it most certainly is, because visitors come and stay there, and when they do, they spend their money in town, so they're at the restaurants, they're buying gasoline, they're using the airport, whatever it might be, and it's a nice amenity, it's on the river, and it's been a great addition to the overall quality of our community. In the lower left, we know it today as Pacific Northwest National Laboratory, and back then it was the Hanford Laboratories and other names, but the winning bidder for that was Battelle out of Columbus, Ohio, and their deal was about as brilliant as the rest of this, but they said, hey, a laboratory doesn't really exist, we'll build one and use our private money to do it, and they did. And in exchange, what they said was, we want the ability to not just do work for Hanford, but we want the ability to do our own private research. And that was agreed to, and was a major feature of that lab for many, 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 many years. But because of that, it allowed Battelle to do a lot of very interesting things beyond Hanford and do research and development for others all over the world and get into all new R&D activities beyond the nuclear activities of Hanford. So that was a win-win-win. I don't know how many wins you could put on that, but it was a great outcome from this. And lastly, on the lower right side there, we have a picture of well, in those days it was called IBP, Iowa Beef Processing. Today it's called Tyson Foods. But it's a beef packing plant that's out in what's called the Wallula area. Again, that's east of the Tri-Cities. And unbelievable, you know, to think of this as a diversification play, but it most certainly is because it's a gigantic facility. It still operates today. Talk about diversification. I mean, there's a case where, you know, we're in the dairy business now, and or beef, not dairy, beef business with cattle, and then creating the meats that come from all of that and shipping that all over the country, if not the world. And so that is a huge facility, still operating today, and came as a result of splitting this contract up and coming up with the scheme of asking the contractors to make alternative investments in the community. So, you know, hats off to those who thought this through, fought all of the bureaucracy that it would have taken to make huge changes like this, and then actually see them implemented. And the impact on the community exists to this day, positive impact on the community this day. Then, as the world changes and communities grow and attitudes change, around the mid-'80s, it became clear that that small group of people were necessary but not sufficient for the future of the community. And they weren't sufficient because the community was growing to the point where a lot of people wanted more of a say and more involvement. And there was no arguing about this. The question was how. Not whether to do it or not. The question was how. Not only that, at this point, Sam, our community godfather, we're in the 80s. Well, he was in his 80s, you know. So we had other issues coming on. Bob Phillips and Glenn Lee were retiring, selling the newspaper. There was a lot of change. So the answer was to merge TRICNIC, the Tri-City Nuclear Industrial Council, with what was then the Tri-Cities Regional Chamber of Commerce, and bring the two together. And so this was a huge shift mentally in how business got done in this town. And the first thing that happened was you end up with a large membership. I mean, TRICNIC was 5 people, 6, you know, in total. But now with the chamber, you have hundreds of business members who are writing checks, paying dues, and are part of the institution, if you will. So the first thing you have to deal with that's new to this whole model is a large membership that needs to be care and fed. You know, if you're paying dues, you want something in return. And so you got to start paying attention to your membership. Second thing that comes with that is a large board of directors. So 3 or 4 people making decisions now turns into 24. So the decision-making process and the number of people who have a seat at the table and have a say expands dramatically. We went from our community godfather, who was donating most of his time, he finally did get some money, but to full-time paid staff. So now we're going up to 6 people who are full-time employees. And so now you have payroll to make and personnel issues and a lot of things that get created. This is also when one of the first things they did, they had administrative people they got from the chamber, they had Sam Volpendus they got from TRICNIC, but they hired and sort of split the mission into a Hanford mission and a diversification mission, and hired the first full-time diversification director, which happened to be yours truly. This also provided the resources to hire lobbyists. So where Sam and the other leaders were the faces and voices of the community in Olympia or in Washington, D.C., we could supplement that now, or they could, with full-time professional hired lobbyists, both in Olympia and in Washington, D.C., which gave them tremendous additional reach. The other thing that was new here was public entity involvement. And this was really new because TRICNIC had been just a private deal, not accountable to anybody. But when you start asking the cities or giving the cities a seat at the table, or the county commissioners a seat at the table, things change dramatically. And now you have to be more accountable publicly, and you have to deal with the politics of those sorts of points of view. So it became pretty complicated. Along with that came a mix of money, where TRICNIC had been fully privately funded, and it was pretty easy to do that. Now, there was a mix. So the cities are putting in money, our port districts are putting in money, our public utility districts are putting in money, eventually the state put in money. And so now you have a mix of private resources and public dollars, and your accountability escalates almost exponentially when you're having to deal with public dollars, tax dollars. The other thing that came with this was committees. There were none in TRICNIC. And the chamber, any chamber of commerce is loaded with them. And so with that came this huge committee structure, and the question of what is it that they do, and how do we keep them or not? And if we want to disband them, how are they going to feel about being disbanded? The good news is through this, there was a lot of financial security. There was a lot of money. And the chamber had some debt. They had a building, all of that debt got retired. There was $1 million in reserve. Things really, bode well financially. Then there was the membership dues, the public money. Financing was not a problem to keep the doors open and make payroll. And they remained politically strong. And so they were the voice of the Tri-Cities, and much is true yet today with what's called now the Tri-City Development Council, but in those days the Tri-City Industrial Development Council, or TRIDEC. So TRICNIC morphed into the TRIDEC, and it still exists today, and you'll hear from them in a later session. The purposes remain the same. Keep that production mission going, plutonium production mission going, find other federal missions that could complement or supplement it at Hanford, and try and diversify the economy beyond on Hanford. So none of that changed. What really changed was just how you went about doing it. And now it became an infinitely complex kind of scenario. If I should be mentioned that, there were other things going on, and I think it's hard to point to who really to credit, and I don't think we should worry about that at all, and just accept that a lot goes on when a lot of people care and try and make things happen, and that's the important part of all this. But in those days, it was the heady days, and leading up to the mid-'80s, it was the heady days of nuclear and the commercial nuclear industry. And so, we were building 3 nuclear power plants here through the supply system, 2 in Satsop. We had a fusion materials, a radiation test facility that had been built as part of the laboratory, so we were in the fusion business in a way. The fast flux test facility, which was the fast breeder reactor program on the forefront of nuclear technology, had been built. We had non-destructive testing spin-off companies going on a bunch in the community. Non-destructive testing was a huge part of the nuclear industry in its early years, understanding what's going on with the fuel and the cladding and all the materials inside a reactor. And so we had instrumentation businesses here that were developing. We became the home of one of 3 nuclear waste repository projects in America. One devoted for, let's see, how can I put this? There was 3 different geologies, and they had 3 projects in America: Texas, in Nevada, and here. And so in terms of new federal missions, think about that. Now we've gone into the fast breeder reactor program, which is not plutonium production. We've gone into the fusion program. We're into the nuclear waste repository business for commercial nuclear fuel. We're into non-destructive testing. So the nuclear-oriented diversification of the community all of that was unfolding during this 60s to 80s period, and it was a really great thing and very, very, very impressive. And so that's the story that leads us up to some dark days. And this began right in the mid-'80s and unfolded towards the end of the 80s, so 86, 87, 89. But it's hard to pinpoint the exact beginning of this, but in my mind, I had started at TRIDEC on April 1st of 1986, and I forget now, but I think Chernobyl happened in May. But the Chernobyl accident happened, and boy, I'll tell you, things started to unravel quickly. But among the things were, unfortunately and technically incorrectly, N reactor was likened to Chernobyl. There was just enough layperson's view that they were similar that got too wonky technically nuclear-wise and otherwise to overcome, and people just painted the picture that N reactor was another Chernobyl. And sure enough, the way things evolved, N reactor closed. Now, when N reactor closed, then everything that was part of the nuclear materials production mission, so one of the top priorities of TRIDEC and its predecessor, ended. So this was no other reactor. This wasn't mothballing N reactor. This was closing it. And when you close N reactor, a lot of dominoes start to fall right after it. Among those was the steam generating plant. So 800 megawatts of commercial electricity, nuclear generated, goes away. So you lose N reactor, you lose the steam plant associated with it. The next thing is, and this is the bottom picture there, is the Purex plant. We had restarted the Purex plant, and that's one of the nuclear fuel reprocessing plants at Hanford. I'm sure you saw that in an earlier session. And it had restarted after being mothballed, and it restarted in 1983. And with the demise of N reactor, which is the source of fuel for the Purex plant, then there was no more need for the Purex plant. So this was the last operating facility at Hanford. When N reactor closed, that was the end of Purex and truly the end of the nuclear material production mission. And it took a few years for all that to unfold, as there was fuel to run through it, et cetera, et cetera. But basically, it meant it was over. Hanford, it was over. It was done. And nothing to come to replace it. So you talk about a shock, but that wasn't all. Because happening around the same time as all of this was the Washington Public Power Supply System building the 3 nuclear plants here and the 2 it sets up in the other side of the state, was going through a bond default and the mothballing and abandonment of their plants, leading to just Columbia Generating Station, the one that's out there today. So we went from 5, 3 here, 2 on the other side of the state, we went to 1. And the number of people out of jobs were just, it was staggering. So that was happening. Then, we're not done yet. Then Congress decides, you know what? We're not going to look at 3 different geologies for nuclear waste repository in America. We're just going to pick one. Politically, Congress is. Forget the technical side of this. And what do they pick? Nevada. So what's that do to the Basalt Waste Isolation Project here at Hanford? Shuts it down. So that closes in short order. Around the same time, new leadership in the Department of Energy says we're going to be more transparent, and information starts coming out about all the operations of Hanford from the beginning, things like what was called the Green Run, where they, I'm sure you've been briefed on all this or will, but information like that came out and started painting the most negative picture imaginable about Hanford and its impact on the region, including agriculture. And so the supposition was that we had contaminated the land. The agriculture community went nuts, saying, oh my God, no one ever told us about this. And so that was another sort of straw that broke the camel's back, if you will, in all of this. So the anti-nuclear sentiment now was just skyrocketing. And on the west side of the state, it was ugly. I mean, there were billboards with upside down, dead cows saying, don't be cowed, shut down Hanford. I mean, it was, it really pitted, east versus west and just about everybody against Hanford and us. Same time, we're losing power, or clout, if you will. I probably shouldn't use that word power, but clout in Washington, D.C. I mentioned that Scoop was passed away. Warren Magnuson was out. There was junior senators coming in with no seniority. Same on the congressional side, in the House of Representatives, and so that became a problem. We had nowhere to go to pull strings, and as I put it, in my view, our economy went into free fall. And I'm not kidding you. The conversations we had in board meetings in those days were people are walking into the banks, turning in the keys to their car. Here, it's yours. Turning in the keys to their house. Here, it's yours. Thousands of people were out of work, and our conversations were not, how can we create jobs, although we'll get to that, but the conversation was, how can we stop the flood of departures? I mean, we were having conversations, can we hold job losses to 10,000 people? Now, in this town in those days, I mean, that was, well, let me just try some quick numbers on you again. Here we go, on the wonky thing. But 25% of the people in this town employed were Hanford employees, 25%. So 1 out of every 4 were Hanford employees. But because of the payroll, because of the amount of money they made in this community, they represented 40% of the economy. And because they represented 40% of the economy, we estimated that for every one Hanford person, there was one non-Hanford person employed, in a shoe store or in a restaurant. And so every loss at Hanford was 2 in the town, and their families and everything else. And so the economic impact was just absolutely enormous. And you'll hear in a later session, by the way, how dramatically how much lower those numbers are today in terms of Hanford employment and their impact on the economy versus back then. And it is a heck of a story and a great success. So with that, and in those kinds of meetings, I got to tell you, it was panic, and we were afraid, and that was sort of the state of affairs at the time. And it would have been one thing to sit there and say, well, this is the end, but there was no way we were going to stand for it. And so the question was, what do we do? What do we do next? So that's my conclusion to part 1.